was called Colditz. It lies 12 miles southeast of Leipzig. During its lifetime, Colditz Castle had been a civil prison, a lunatic asylum, and a Hitler youth work camp. From late 1939, it housed captured Polish officers. The castle's main attraction lay in its defences. It had a dry moat with a high outer wall. Beyond this, there was a drop of some 30 feet to terraced gardens, which themselves were built on top of a further wall. The castle was also built on a promontory overlooking the river Mulde. It appeared to be totally escape-proof. By the end of 1940, Colditz had some 500 inmates: French, Polish, Dutch, Belgians, and British. They were crowded within the castle's forbidding walls, and to guard and administer them, there were 300 German soldiers. These also had to be housed, and lived around one of the castle's two main courtyards. The prisoners occupied the other. The castle was ringed by 18 watchtowers, equipped with machine guns, and sentries constantly patrolled between each pair. There were always 2 sentries in the prisoners' courtyard. Furthermore, there was a team of Abwehr, intelligence personnel, called ferrets by the prisoners. These spent their time prowling around the prisoners' quarters, watching for any signs of forbidden activity. Special electrically operated sound devices were planted to detect any escape tunnels that the prisoners might try to dig. At night, the castle was floodlit from all angles to enable the sentries to spot any attempt to climb out of Colditz. The atmosphere for the inmates was claustrophobic. Their day was built around appel, the morning and evening roll calls, when they were counted to ensure that none were missing. But all this failed to deter the prisoners. Military intelligence in London devised ingenious ways of smuggling vital escape equipment to the POWs, including hiding maps and German money inside board games. The prisoners requested particular items through the letters they were allowed to send home. These incorporated secret codes, which went undetected by the vigilant German censors. Each national group of POWs had its own escape committee. These coordinated all escape attempts to ensure that one did not compromise another. The escape committees also gathered intelligence on life in wartime Germany. For getting out of Colditz was only half the battle, and the escapers had to be able to merge with the population at large. It was impossible to travel anywhere in Germany and occupied Europe without the correct identity papers and passes. If these were the slightest bit flawed, arrest could be instant. The escapers therefore needed the right papers and a convincing cover story. To obtain information on identity cards and passes, the escape committees bribed guards and closely questioned recaptured prisoners. The prisoners themselves then forged the necessary documents, and so skilled did they become that the papers were indistinguishable from the genuine article. One of the traditional means of escape from POW camps was by tunneling. In a normal camp, which was built on earth or sand, these would be run under the perimeter fence from the prisoners' huts. In Colditz, however, it was more difficult, because any tunnel had to penetrate the castle walls and the rock on which it was built. Nevertheless, a number of tunnels were dug, using tools made from the prisoners' iron bedsteads. That is, until the Germans replaced them with wooden bed frames in 1943. There were no successful escapes by tunnel. Another escape method was to dress up as a German soldier, but this entailed much ingenuity. Dutch uniforms were the easiest to convert, being the closest in color, bribery was used to obtain the necessary dyes. Most of the attempts to get out in disguise failed, although some men did bluff their way out of Colditz before being apprehended. 6 POWs did, however, enjoy some success by disguising themselves as a German fatigue party. They got into the German Sergeant Major's office and penetrated a storeroom beyond it. Carrying boxes, they exited from the storeroom, bluffed the sentries on the side gate, and got away. 4 were soon recaptured. The other 2, a Briton and a Dutchman, walked for 20 miles and then took local trains as far as Hof. During the next 3 days, they made their way ever further southwards via Würzburg, staying in a cheap hotel in Stuttgart overnight, and then journeying on to neutral Switzerland. Lieutenant Eri Nieve of the Royal Artillery and Dutchman Lieutenant Tony Lutyens made a similar successful escape. They got into a loft above the German officers' mess and waited until it was empty. They were disguised as German officers and used these knotted bedsheets to climb down into the mess itself. This gave the 2 men the perfect cover to enter the courtyard without arousing German suspicions. Once they did so, they even berated a German corporal for failing to salute them before making their way through the main gate. They then successfully scaled 3 walls and got out of the castle grounds before slipping off their uniforms. They were now disguised as foreign workers sent as forced labor to Germany. An advantage of this cover was that the escapers did not have to be fluent in German. Nieve and Lutyens also planned to travel mainly by train. They got as far as Ulm, hoping to reach the Polish port of Gdynia, but their papers did not allow them to travel any closer to the Polish frontier. They therefore took local trains, which their papers allowed them to do, and approached the border by a circuitous route. Then they took to their feet, Nieve following the railway across the frontier. He eventually reached the port of Danzig, now Gdansk, and noticed a number of neutral Swedish ships in the harbor. He selected one vessel, evaded the single sentry on the quayside, and slipped aboard. The crew agreed to hide him. On arrival in Sweden, Nieve was first placed in a police cell, but then taken to Stockholm and handed over to the British embassy. He remained here for almost 6 weeks before being flown home to Britain. The Colditz exercise areas included a small park outside the camp and surrounded by wire fences. A number of attempts were made to overcome these. One British officer, Lieutenant Michael Sinclair, who was known as the Red Fox by his comrades because of his persistent attempts to escape, was shot dead by a German guard as he tried to scale the wire. Earlier, however, a French cavalry officer, Lieutenant Mérès Lebrun, literally vaulted over the wire while exercising in the park and reached Switzerland a week later. The castle walls provided another escape route, even though a high degree of mountaineering skill was required. This was the method used by the most successful of the British escapes, which took place in the early hours of the 15th of October, 1942. 50 years later, Major Ronnie Littledale, one of the 4 officers involved, demonstrated the route they took down the terraces to the barbed wire outer gate, which they scaled. Littledale and Lieutenant Commander Billy Stevens then traveled south by train. Soon they reached the Alps. They left the railway and set off on foot for the Swiss border, lying up by day. They crossed after 5 days and gave themselves up to the Swiss police. The other pair were Flight Lieutenant Hank Wardle and Captain Pat Reed, a long-time member of the escape committee who marked his arrival in Switzerland in a special way.
Of course, one thing I couldn't forget when I got across was to send a postcard from a post office as soon as I could get to one. And I think I used words to the effect that simple code language, wish you were here, enjoying the snows of Switzerland, something like that.
Colditz had now become predominantly a British camp, its numbers swelled by officers transferred from elsewhere after attempted escapes. The fresh blood helped to maintain the determination of the original inmates, who had now been incarcerated in the castle for 3 long years. Among the new arrivals was David Sterling, founder of the Special Air Service, the SAS, who had been captured in Tunisia in February 1943. The prisoners were kept in touch with the progress of the war, as transmitted by the BBC, through a secret radio left to them by the French and hidden in one of the castle's attics. Shorthand writers took down the evening news verbatim and read it out to the rest. Thus, the Colditz POWs learnt of the Allied invasion of Italy in September 1943 and the subsequent advance northwards. As one Italian town after another was liberated, the prisoners began to feel that the war was slowly getting closer. On the Eastern Front, too, there was ever more good news as the Russians liberated their country and thrust westwards. But the most exciting news of all came on the 6th of June, 1944. This was the Allied landings in Normandy. The success of these meant that the war in Europe was surely entering its final stage. As the Allied build-up continued, the Colditz Escape Committee put a ban on further escape attempts. A mass escape from a POW camp in Poland had resulted in 50 British officers being summarily executed by the Gestapo. But this did not halt the most audacious of the Colditz escape plans. Flight Lieutenant Bill Goldfinch and pre-war racing driver Tony Rolt dreamed up an idea which was remarkable for its ingenuity. For Goldfinch had designed a glider, which he was certain would fly. It was constructed in one of Colditz Castle's attics, under conditions of great secrecy. The basic materials were bedboards and sheets, with even the tools being entirely homemade. The plan was to launch it from the attic in the spring of 1945, when the winds were likely to be favorable. It meant a long wait throughout the winter, but Lockwood and Rolt were convinced that when the time came, the glider would carry them beyond the town of Colditz. However, in October 1944, with the Western Allies now approaching the German border, London categorically forbade any further escapes from Colditz. Victory was in sight, and there was little point in the prisoners risking their lives in an ever more desperate Germany. That autumn saw new arrivals in Colditz, General Bor Komorowski and some of his officers. He had led the uprising of the Polish Home Army in Warsaw in August 1944, in the hope that it would aid the advancing Russians liberate the Polish capital. Bor Komorowski and his men fought on for 10 weeks. But the Russians halted their offensive, and he and his surviving followers were forced to surrender. After a grim winter, better news reached the Colditz prisoners in March 1945, when the Western Allies crossed the River Rhine, Germany's last natural obstacle in the West. Thereafter, the Allied advance was rapid, and the liberation of Colditz became increasingly imminent. German cities and towns fell one after another. But sometimes the Waffen-SS and other fanatical elements put up a tough fight. At Colditz, there was a real danger that the SS would shoot the inmates after they refused to leave the castle for a march eastwards. The Americans closed on the town and fought a sharp battle with the German garrison before driving it out. As they did so, the German garrison in the castle surrendered to the POWs and asked for protection. Now, at last, like so many other Allied prisoners of war, the Colditz inmates were freed. Some of the men had been prisoners for over 5 years. Now they could finally go home, some joining the long columns of ex-POWs of many nationalities, making their own way back. They passed columns of Germans marching into captivity. The boot was now on the other foot. Most of the British Colditz prisoners were flown back to Britain, there to try and fill the blank in their young lives that their time in captivity had been. Nevertheless, Colditz had provided its inmates with a perpetual challenge. But not until 50 years later were Colditz's former guests allowed back, since during the Cold War the castle had lain in communist East Germany. It was an emotional time for them as sharp memories of their youth were rekindled. Once more they could see the evidence of some of their escapes and relive them. For no less than 300 escape attempts had been made from the castle during the war. 130 prisoners had got out of the castle, and 30 of them made it home. They had proved that Colditz was not escape-proof. Doing so had kept up their spirits and maintained their sanity. For the perpetual challenge to outwit their jailers had kept their minds active. It had imbued them with a sense of adventure and a purpose in life. That is the message of Colditz.